If you were to interview the people who worked at Apple who are no longer there, they will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that my years at Apple were the single greatest years of my entire career. And if you were to ask them why, they would say, because Steve Jobs inspired me. Bud Tribble of Apple came up with a term, the reality distortion field. Steve Jobs could so see around corners because all he did was think about it. Genius is not genetics. What a lie the world has sold us. Genius is about practice. It's about study. It's about getting the right coaching. It's being in the right peer group. When he was, the homebrew club. Am I getting too deep, right? Remember the homebrew club, him and Wozniak? All these guys did was check out the circuit boards and this, and he did it his entire life because an obsession is only unhealthy if it's an unhealthy obsession. And then after his years of devotion and practice and learning and study and influences, he became Steve Jobs. And then we say Steve Jobs is a genius. Are you getting this? Genius is not genetics or natural talent. Genius is about character. It's about doing the right things. And if you do these, I wish they taught this to people in school. This is science-based. Kids need to know this. So they say, I got it. I can do these things and I can perform at genius. The world would be great. Where I want to go in my life, and this is not at all about me, is I want to shift from what I'm doing now, and I want to get to a place in my career where I'm building schools as a humanitarian. That's where, teaching this methodology using digital platforms to kids, etc. But that's another story. So, Steve Jobs, how could he see around corners? It's all he did, all he practiced, etc., etc. When Steve Jobs was a little kid, his father said, Steve, go outside and paint the fence. Steve Jobs was unbelievably inspired by his father. His father was the craftsman. His father meticulously kept the tools. The user experience being gorgeous came from his father. Steve Jobs went outside and he painted the fence. A few hours later, Steve Jobs' father comes out and goes, Steve, did you paint the fence? Steve Jobs looks at his dad. He goes, yeah, Dad, look there, I painted the fence. Steve Jobs' father said, well, Steve, you did a great job painting the outside of the fence, but Steve, you just didn't paint the inside of the fence. And Steve Jobs looked at his dad and said, but Dad, no one's going to see the inside of the fence. Steve Jobs' father said, but son, we will. Now it's the mid-1980s and Steve Jobs is working with his team at Apple. And he looks at his design team and he says, I want you to build a computer so beautiful it brings tears to people's eyes. Because Steve Jobs was not an entrepreneur. Steve Jobs was an artist. He just wanted to bring beautiful things to as many people as possible. The world is less of a place because Steve Jobs is not in the world. And then Steve Jobs looked at his team and said, but here's the real deliverable. I want you to make the inside of the computer so beautiful it looks like art. And Steve Jobs' design team said, but Steve, no one's going to see the inside of the computer. And he looked at his design team and he said, but we will. And when Steve Jobs saw that first Apple Macintosh, he started to cry. And then he asked his team, now you go sign the circuit board. And they said, why? And he said, because all artists sign their work.